Good morning. Welcome to week 5. This week we will be covering requirements analysis and design definition. Let me share my screen with you. Okay. That's great. So as I said, we'll be covering requirements analysis and design definition. Please note that I've created 2 different videos just for the sake of keeping things nice and short and succinct for you to be able to digest. So we'll start with part 1 of 2 videos. So I've got just this reminder because I've noticed that some of the questions that we get in the study group in Facebook is around this concept, around how the information in the BABOK guide tend to relate to each other. So I would like you to keep in the back of your mind as you are progressing through all of this learning that the knowledge areas do not follow each other in any specific sequence and that the BABOK in itself is not a methodology. The tasks in knowledge areas can be repeated throughout the life of an initiative or a project. And you will see when we start to delve deeper into this particular knowledge area that there are very clear overlaps between the tasks that you might be performing as part of strategy analysis, for example, or elicitation and collaboration. And you will see how all of that starts to fit in with what we are doing during this knowledge area. Okay, wonderful. So, as always, let's keep it in context. So we are looking here at the requirements analysis and design definition, which sits pretty much around the middle of our business analysis value spectrum. So we've done some of the needs analysis and the solution scope on the potential side of the value spectrum, which means we've done some high-level analysis around strategy analysis. We've looked at the current state and we've determined that this initiative or business need, in fact, will be progressed further, and we will start to define what it is really all about and what the details are of the requirements as well as the designs. So this is what we'll concern ourselves with in terms of where we are on the spectrum. Right, so let's take a look at what the BABOK says in terms of the requirements analysis and design definition knowledge area. So during this knowledge area, it describes the tasks that business analysts perform to structure and organize requirements discovered during elicitation activities, specify and model requirements and designs, validate and verify information, identify solution options that meet business needs, and estimate the potential value that could be realized for each solution option. So if we then look at the specific tasks that's involved, we will see that we've got 6 different tasks to consider. So during this video, we will be talking about the first 3, specify and model requirements, verify requirements, and validate requirements. Okay, so let's dive right into the first task, specify and model requirements. So according to the BABOK guide, the purpose of this task is to analyze, synthesize, and refine elicitation results into requirements and designs. So if you keep in mind that you may have done a lot of elicitation activities recently, and you are now ready to take all of that business analysis information and take it to the next stage of doing some analysis and synthesis with that information. So we will now delve into what does that look like in practical terms. So we do this by looking at the different elements. So the elements for this particular task is we look at model requirements, analyze requirements, represent requirements and attributes, and implement the appropriate levels of abstraction. So first of all, the first element, model requirements, and this is quite a fundamental yet important aspect of this particular task. And that is to realize that there are 2 formats that you can use to model your requirements. or in most cases combine these two formats. And the one is matrices and the other is diagrams. But the fundamental difference between these two models or formats is that matrices is essentially a matrix structure that kind of collects or depicts a complex set of requirements. And these examples of these could be data dictionaries or a gap analysis that you've done, or a traceability matrix if you still create a normal matrix for it. So that would be when you've got basically a lot of data that you're structuring in a matrix type format. Then on the other hand, you've got diagrams. These are the visual and pictorial representation of requirements. So this is where you'll create diagrams such as data, process, or functional diagrams. Now, keeping that in mind, let's have a look at the next dimension of some of the models that we can use when we do show our requirements. And the BABOK has actually defined it into 5 really quite logical categories. The one is referred to as people and roles. So they have gone and taken a lot of the techniques that you'll find in chapter 10 of the BABOK guide, and they've grouped them for us within these categories. So if you look at people and roles, you'll see that techniques such as organizational modeling, roles and permissions, matrix, stakeholder list, maps and personas, these techniques are typically what we'll use when we would like to model requirements that relates to people's roles or people within the organization. The next category is rationale. So this is all about answering the question of why something is the way it is. And this is where we will use techniques such as decision modeling, scope modeling, business model canvas, root cause analysis, and business rules analysis. Then activity flow is one of the categories that a lot of us would use quite frequently within our day-to-day business analysis roles. And this is because we are quite used to sequencing actions or creating a sequence of actions to explain something in terms of requirements. And that typically comes in the format of process modeling or flow charting, as some people tend to call it, use cases and scenarios, and user stories. These are all different ways that you can go and define a sequence of actions. Then the fourth category is capability. And this is all about when you would like to express the capability of an organization or of a system or of a group or a unit. And you could use techniques such as business capability analysis, functional decomposition, or prototyping. And then the last category, which is becoming a lot more important these days again, and that's the data and information category. So this is when we start looking at, so what data do we actually need to capture? What does the data mean? So how does the data flow? Where do we get the data from? And so forth. And that is when you apply techniques such as data dictionaries, data flow diagrams, data modeling, glossaries, state modeling, or interface analysis. So this is really quite a nice way for you to interpret some of the techniques in chapter 10, and a way for you to position and understand the purpose of each of these. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't covered as many techniques as I would have liked so far, but be rest assured that although within the 6 weeks that we're running this study group for, I will, after this period, keep on adding some more techniques videos. So there is more coming. It's just a matter of bandwidth on my part. Okay, so now let's have a look at the second element. Now with this one, it's called analyze requirements. And this is really when we're starting to decompose some of that business analysis information that you would have gathered as part of some of your elicitation activities. And this is all about finding those things or processes or functions or people or structures, anything that must change, anything that must stay the same. You delve into anything that might be missing, and you find any unnecessary components and any constraints or assumptions that impact these components. So this is what they refer to when they say you analyze your requirements. Those are the kinds of dimensions that you would be considering. So this forms a basis for discussion to then get to a conclusion around which solution options will be the best to go forward with. Now, the third element represents requirements and attributes. So this one is about business analysts identifying information for requirements and their attributes as part of the elicitation results. And the requirements should exhibit the characteristics of requirements and design's quality. And this you will find more information about in the next task, verify requirements. All right, so the fourth element to consider when you specify and model requirements is to implement the appropriate levels of abstraction. And you would appreciate my abstract artwork that I've added here, just to say that it's about being able to present your requirements at the correct level of detail and in the correct type of format so that it makes sense to the people that you're talking to, making sure that it meets the needs of the stakeholders that you are presenting to. All right. Now we can go on and have a talk about the verify requirements task. Now it's important for you to perhaps pay a bit of attention here so that you don't get confused between verify requirements and validate requirements, because they are in fact quite different. So the purpose of verifying requirements is to ensure that requirements and design specifications and models meet quality standards and are usable for the purpose they serve. So let's have a look at the elements. So the elements that we need to understand as part of this task, first of all, is the characteristics of requirements and design's quality. Then we'll look at what is the verification activities that we typically do. And finally, the role of checklists. Now, you will see that with all these different characteristics, atomic, complete, consistent, concise, feasible, unambiguous, testable, prioritized, and understandable, these are the characteristics that you would like to be able to always apply when you start defining requirements. So let's run really quickly through what do they each mean. So your requirements should be atomic. This means they should be self-contained and can be understood independently or of other designs or requirements. So it basically means that they shouldn't be half phrases or imply any kind of link to another statement somewhere in your document. So when you read a requirement statement or a user story, it should make sense on its own. Complete, this refers to it has enough information so that the next step can be taken in terms of the work required to implement the requirement. So this will depend a little bit on what methodology and perspective is being used. Consistent, this is about the requirement being aligned with the identified needs of stakeholders and not conflicting with other requirements. Concise, this means it contains no extraneous and unnecessary content. So don't carry on with a lot of information and description if the essence of the requirement has already been stated. So try and be very concise. Feasible, this is that the requirement statement that you are putting forward is a reasonable statement and possible to be implemented within the agreed upon risk, schedule, and budget. Or it's considered feasible enough to investigate further through some experiments and prototypes. Your requirement is unambiguous. So remember that every individual, we all have our own perspectives on subject matters and meaning. So be very careful when you start phrasing your requirements and try and be as unambiguous as possible. So this basically means that it must be clearly stated in such a way to make it clear whether a solution does or does not meet the associated need. Testable. You need to be able to verify that the requirement or design has in fact been fulfilled. So write your requirement in a way that you know when this requirement is implemented or not. Prioritized. This is all about being ranked and grouped or negotiated in terms of importance and value against other requirements. And you know that as part of what we've discussed in a previous knowledge area, requirements lifecycle management, there is a specific task around prioritized requirements. So perhaps refer back to there to have a look at some of the attributes, all of the attributes that play a role in prioritizing requirements. And then finally, your requirements need to be understandable. So this basically just means that use the language that the organization uses. Don't use too many acronyms, especially if your audience don't necessarily have knowledge of what those acronyms mean. And if you do decide to use acronyms, be quite explicit in any documentation, provide a glossary, or be clear about what your acronyms mean. Okay. Now, the second element here is about verification activities. So I'll just take you through some of what this actually could be. This is about checking for compliance with organizational standards. So when you look at requirements that's been prepared, do they comply with what the organization has agreed in terms of methods that will be used and tools that will be used to document requirements? Check for correct use of modeling notation or templates or forums. Just make sure that you're in line with the notation that's been agreed. Checking for completeness with each model, that there's no obvious gaps. Comparing each model against other relevant models and identify gaps between models. There may be information missing, so be sure that every model, although it might be a different perspective, still covers the entire scope of what you're trying to communicate. And then ensure that terminology is expressing the requirement in understandable terms to the audience. And I think that would also come through if you check that characteristic for your requirements. All right, so the third element for this task is around checklists. Checklists are used to ensure that items determined to be important are included in the final requirements, deliverables, or that the steps required for the verification process are followed. So you might, within your particular BA team, you might agree that you'll do peer reviews to run through a series of checks to make sure that everybody in the team are delivering requirements consistently across the team and that you are adhering to the different aspects that's been agreed within the team that your requirements should adhere to. Okay, so now let's jump into task validate requirements. So we've just talked about verify, and this is to a large extent about the consistency, understandability, and a particular quality of your requirement statements. Whereas validate is quite something else. So with validate, according to the BABOK guide, this is to ensure that all requirements and designs align to the business requirements and support the delivery of needed value. So this is all about making sure that the content of the requirements themselves is what the business is asking for. So there are three different elements to keep in mind. First of all, they say identify assumptions. The second thing to consider is to define measurable evaluation criteria. And then the third one is evaluate alignment with solution scope. So let's have a quick look at what is this identify assumptions. So basically this is about if there is uncertainty or a product or service that you are part of being delivered for the organization is a brand new domain for the organization, then it might be required to make some assumptions for work to continue. Or in some cases, stakeholders might be making their own assumptions about the benefits or the value of a particular requirement set of requirements. So they may think or making the assumption that the requirements will be delivering X amount of value to their unit. This may or may not pan out to be the case. So you as the business analyst would identify that they are making those assumptions, but it cannot be proven yet. So perhaps those assumptions, if they are quite large assumptions, is worth raising as a risk in your initiative to make sure that the team can manage those assumptions as potential risks. So that if you need to be more, as you discover more information or as more information becomes available, that you ensure that you keep everybody up to date so that the expectations can be managed. Then element 2, this is about define measurable evaluation criteria. So basically this is about you defining some evaluation criteria that can be used to evaluate how successful the change has been after the solution is implemented. Now, with this particular element, you will find a little down the track when we get to the knowledge area solution evaluation, there will be more talk around how we do measure solutions. So we will look at that in more detail. But also, in the meantime, I highly recommend that you read an article that I've put together, available on our website blog, that's referred to at the bottom. I think it's on the blog first or second page. It's all about basically understanding the difference between acceptance and evaluation criteria. And this will also help aid you to understand within the BABOK guide the technique that says define acceptance and evaluation criteria. Okay, so the third element as part of validate requirements is evaluate alignment with the solution scope. So a requirement may be delivering a benefit to a stakeholder, but may not be a desirable part of a solution. Or a requirement, however, that doesn't deliver value could become a candidate for elimination. So it's important that every requirement is there because it has to be there. It would either be adding direct value to the organization, or it will be a requirement that is essential for another requirement that will add value in terms of a dependency relationship. So it's important that you have a good look through the requirements and make sure that every requirement has got a license to be there, a valid license. So a design that doesn't support a requirement, the requirement might be misunderstood or the design might need to be changed. So as you can remember when we talked about traceability, this will help you to identify any requirements that doesn't have a direct link back to business requirements or basically the defined solution scope. Make sure that your requirements are valid. Make sure that your requirements are serving a real business purpose, and that will help you to be sure that any designs that are developed on the back of your requirements are in fact going to be valid too. All right, yay, we've got a flash quiz. So we've got, I think, 3 questions today. So let's dive straight in. Great, so question 1. When you verify requirements, part of what you will do is to ensure your requirements characteristics are atomic. Is that true or false? 1, 2, 3. True, of course. We've just said atomic is one of the characteristics that every requirement should have. Question 2. Verifying requirements mean that you ensure and requirements align to business requirements and support the delivery of needed value. Is that true or false? Think about this. 3, 2, 1. False. That is validate requirements that does this. All right, question 3. When stakeholders assume requirements can deliver certain benefits, you may need to identify and manage those as assumptions or those assumptions as risks. Is that true or false? 3, 2, 1. True. We said just before that sometimes that might happen. Okay, wonderful. So over to you before we delve into the rest of this knowledge area. Any questions that you might have about any of these tasks, please raise them to us in the Facebook group. Any examples, as always, that you can share with everybody. And finally, is there anything that you can think of in the context of what we've just discussed that could be useful for everyone to know in relation to the exam? All right, well, thanks once again. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to sharing the next video with you in a little while.